I mean, if you talk about the FLDS and the Plymouth Brethren, they're both very Bible-based. There's a lot of similarities, but the FLDS has got this weird kind of polygamy, sexual angle to it that's like a really weird, way out distortion of Christianity. The Brethren have very conventional marriage, but then they've got this really weird cultish obsession with money. And, like the FBI go into Warren Jeffs because of sexual abuse, and the ATO go into the Brethren because of financial abuse. It's all, it's just their particular vice, but they take it to such extremes that what starts off as being legal, but a little bit kind of greedy and materialistic, it just gets worse and worse until it's actually criminal. And that's the point at which the authorities come down like a ton of bricks and do what they've been itching to do for a long time.
Right. And there's always that one specific thing that the authorities finally have enough to go on to go after a group.
Exactly.
Because what the authorities finally get them for is one thing, but the unfortunate thing that we see time and time again is all of the same things, the abusive things, whether it's financial, sexual, all these things are happening in almost all of the groups we talk to.
Absolutely.
And once it cracks open, all the worms come out of the can.
Welcome back, everyone. My name is Sam.
And I'm Melissa.
I was born and raised in the FLDS community. It is a polygamous group run by Warren Jeffs, and I moved out when I was 18 years old.
I was raised LDS. Sam and I have been married for almost 10 years and have 2 awesome kiddos.
Yes, we do. We want to quickly thank our donors, YouTube members, and our patrons over on Patreon. We really do appreciate your support.
Yes, today we were really excited to have 2 awesome people from the podcast Get a Life podcast, and that is Cheryl and Richard. They are from the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church, or the PBCC, sometimes also known as the Exclusive Brethren. We'll get more into that of how the name of the church has changed. We recently did a reaction video to a documentary all about the Exclusive Brethren, and it was very interesting, and I will leave that link above. But they reached out to us and said, we have so much more information. There's so many more similarities to the FLDS that they were willing to share with us. And so we're just really grateful and happy that you're here. Thank you so much, Cheryl and Richard, for being here.
Thanks so much for having us.
No, you're welcome.
We were so glad when you reached out talking, saying that you would be willing to come on and share more about this, because the documentary that we watched was very short. And I was like, okay, there is so much more to this group.
Has to be. Yes.
Oh, man. And
But the little bit that we did see, it reminded me a lot of some of the experiences I had within the FLDS church. So very interesting to see so many similarities, even on the other side of the world in some cases. So thank you so much for being here with us as experts and from this community yourselves to help answer some of these questions for us.
Yeah. So they've rebranded themselves in 2012, and they're known as the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church now. And then prior to that, they were known as the Exclusive Brethren. So when you do a Google search, always use those two groups of names, and all of the controversy comes up.
Okay.
So why the name change?
Well, they got into trouble in the UK because they're a very closed group. And they have all these meeting halls right across the UK, which were all free of rates, tax-free as religious buildings. And the tax authorities, they did a little rule change in government whereby they say, if you want tax relief, you have to be for the public benefit. As in a charity, it's not good enough just to be a religion. And of course, when the government had a look at these people, the Brethren's doctrine at that time was very specifically that you don't give to charities. It's wrong to give to charities. So, of course, they're entirely self-interested. They have no dealings with the outside world in a charitable sense. So, the government took away their charitable status, or at least for their meeting halls, which was a big financial hit for them. And so their reaction was to do a kind of $1 million publicity campaign. They hired all the top PR companies. They kind of cooked up an instant Just Add Water charity called Rapid Relief Team with bright red tents It was actually copied off the sort of Billy Graham charity, which is called the Rapid Response Team, I think. It just literally carbon copied it and, rushed around serving burgers to nurses and all sorts of kind of mock charitable activities, and eventually managed to claw back charitable status. But at that point, they realized that they needed to kind of incorporate or have a central body that could, represent them. So because they were known as the Exclusive Brethren, that wasn't the name they took themselves, that's just what they were called. But of course, exclusive is a very negative connotation if you're trying to get charitable status. And so they wanted to move away from the exclusive and call themselves Plymouth Brethren Christian Church to emphasize the point they're Christian, which is highly debatable. But
Interesting.
that's why they rebranded, because the old brand was so tarnished. They needed to do a phoenix and reinvent themselves as this lovely, warm, Christian, outgoing charity, which they're not.
Wow. I think there's a lot of churches in the United States that would not like if you couldn't be nonprofit or get not have taxes just from being a religious institution as well, because there's a lot.
Yeah.
It was their Hail Mary. It very much was.
Okay.
Gotcha. Okay.
Interesting.
So going to your guys' roots, where are you from, and were you born into the church, or what was your upbringing like?
So yeah, I was born into the church. Mostly 99.9% of the people are born into the church. They don't recruit, and it's very, very, very hard to get in it. So it's just those that are born into it. And so I was born and raised in a small town known as Maple Creek, Saskatchewan, in Canada. And yeah, it was, your typical grassroots brethren with just a lot of controversy in behind closed doors. So life for me started rocky very, very early on in life. My dad had a really bad accident when I was 3 years old. And inside the cult is when something happens, you just get automatically dropped off at anybody else's house that's in proximity that belongs to the church. And so I happened to be dropped off at this house where my sexual abuse started. And from there, I was sexually trafficked, and it's a very long, horrific, arduous life that I had. And I left at 17. And the reason why I ended up leaving at 17 was I started getting these priestly visits that were just horrific. My whole family did. We were on the bottom of the totem pole. And I stayed in there for my dad. So I had been programmed very early on that what I was doing was to help my dad. And so I had just this very, very heartfelt, I needed to be there to save my dad. So I stayed and stayed and stayed and stayed I thought I was protecting him. And I mean, he was treated really, really horribly. And it came to a point where we had this one priestly visit it just did it for me. And so for myself at that point in time, I wasn't even planning on leaving. I was just planning on, I was going to take my life. It came down to, for me, I was going home. I was like, I'm not going to go through this torture anymore. I'm going home. And my mom actually found my suicide poem, and that stopped everything. Then I had to reroute myself of like, okay, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? I ended up befriending somebody else in there who I was recognizing was also rebelling and struggling. And her and I left together. And it was the best day of my life and the worst day of my life. And I mean, I'm sure you all can relate to that, right? Like, that you're leaving your family. You know that everything that you'll never, ever have contact with again. I did keep in contact with my parents off and on, but it became a mental health issue for me, and I had to make a choice. And so when my husband was going through a heart transplant, I needed that extra gas, and I couldn't do the guilt trips and the shame and all that stuff when I was having conversations with my parents. And so I ended up cutting them off. So for me growing up it was horrific. It was hard. It was very, very, very hard. And I still to this day do therapy every 2 weeks to live my beautiful life that I have. But it is one of those things that it's super important to know how to take care of your wounds in order to be able to have the most, that beautiful life that we know that we can have for the freedom that we fought for.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So when you say community, is it actually like, is everybody that's a part of this church, are they separated from society? Are you living next door to people who are non-members? Are you only in neighborhoods that are owned and operated by people within the church? What does that look like? How close are you to the world?
So yes, you are integrated into the world per se. So I went to normal schools when I was growing up. Today, now they have their own school system. So I was part of the last generation that left when they switched to homeschooling. And then from homeschooling, they created their own schools. But yes, you very much live in amongst everybody else, but they have this separation rule where you're not to be of the world. So to them, it is, you use the world for the things that you need, but you get in and you get out. Right.
That sounds
And
familiar.
yeah. And so you'll hear a lot of on our podcast and a lot of things that we talk about where you'll hear talked about stealing from or what is it called? Spoiling the Egyptians. What is it
Spoiling
called?
the Egyptians, yeah.
Yes. It's called spoiling the Egyptians. And so they believe that the world is theirs for the taking. And what you see now today in 2024 in the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church is a business run as a church. It's money orientated. They're worth billions and billions of dollars.
Wow, isn't that sad that that's in so many cases what it comes down to is
Yeah.
the money and the trafficking in one way or another. And I'm so sorry, Cheryl, to hear that you had to personally deal with some of that stuff. When you mentioned the abuse, was all of that within your church, or were you in other bad situations outside of the church?
Yeah, I was in other bad situations outside of the church, but the person who introduced me to everything was in the church. So he was the one that took me to these other places. He introduced me to, I had a lady driver that to this day, I don't know if she was in the church or not. I 100% don't think she was, but
Dealing with outside.
Yeah.
I'm
yeah,
so
but very
sorry.
much so I was trafficked to Hutterites. I don't know if you know what they are. They're like Mennonites,
Yes.
but
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, that was one of my very first place I went to was a mobile home that a bunch of Hutterites came to.
Wow.
But the person who first abused me, he had a job driving propane. He delivered propane everywhere. So he very much had he had the routes to be able to take me to where he needed to take me to. Yeah.
Wow. I'm so sorry. I don't even really know where to begin with. I just feel so icky inside when I hear stories like this. And I know that it happened within the FLDS as well, but thankfully not to me personally. So I'm glad that there are people like yourself out there sharing this and getting this information out there so that people can be more aware.
And that was the main reason why I did the podcast was I actually had been given a family picture of my brother with all his kids. And my brother had worked for the same business where my perpetrator was. And it was just a shocking realization to me to look at this picture and realize that his daughters had grown up and would have been at the age where they would have been placed to go and work somewhere. Well, in my mind, it was like, oh my goodness, my nieces could have this opportunity where they're going to be placed in arm's length of this man. And so at that point, I went and did a police report. It wasn't even for me. I didn't even do it for me at that point. It was because I was dealing with this on my own. Well, trying to deal with this on my own as best you can. It's one thing to deal with it in your own little cave. It's a whole other thing to be able to come out public for the benefit of somebody else, because you really have to put that shame, the guilt, everything that comes with that tumultuous life that you live underneath everything. I had to put that aside, put on my big girl panties, as I say, and be like, I had to do it for my nieces because I didn't want them showing up at my doorstep 5 years from now and telling me the same story that I lived. I would have felt awful as an auntie. I've never met them, but at that same time, I knew that I had a responsibility to make sure that, I went to the police, and then I had to become public and put my story out there. I've released his name. I've come out public as much as I could so that I could alert that town and be like, no, like you guys need to understand what actually went on.
Good.
Good for you. I think sometimes, especially when you're raised in certain groups where you feel like things happening to you, you just have to handle by yourself. And that's how I was raised too, and then seeing loved ones go through it, or like you're saying with your nieces, those can be the moments where you're like, okay, it's
That's
too
enough.
much. Like it's crazy the amount that we are almost willing to take on ourselves. But when we see those that we love going through it, whether it's abuse or whether it's religious trauma or any other type of things like that, those can a lot of times be those like breaking points.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, just to expand on that, I mean, I did go to the police, but I do have to say that they have done nothing, right? So I actually drew a line the other day and wrote a long letter, put it out to the news outlet that have covered this before. It was after watching the 7M TikTok Netflix series, if anybody hasn't watched it. And it was the last episode on that where triggered me. My body was shaken from head to toe, and I knew they had gone up against the same issue. And so it was one of those things. It's been 2 years since I filed my report. Today is my 2 years today. Wow. And I knew I needed to draw a line in the sand and just be like, I went quiet to allow them to do what they did, and nothing took place. And so, sometimes it is the voice of the people that, when there's enough that come together, are what make the changes that we need.
Absolutely.
Amen. Well, thank you so much, Cheryl, for sharing that. Richard, I know that you are not in the best place with the church. It seems like they're after you. Can you share with us a little bit about your backstory and what led you to kind of where you are today?
Sure. Well, I had a much happier upbringing than Cheryl, thankfully. Until I got into my teens, I was quite happy in my little tiny world. My parents were quite well off. They were both university educated, which doesn't happen now. I mean, in the 1960s, university education was banned. So we didn't have TV or radio, but my parents were my mother was a school teacher, and so we grew up with lots of books, and we had like a big backyard and lots of trees. And so yeah, it was a nice childhood, and you didn't realize that you were actually being deprived of all sorts of other things. Things got rough when you went to secondary school. I mean, primary school was difficult, but secondary school was terrible because, you were visibly different from everyone else because you were taken out of the sex educations, out of the TV, and you had to sit out a school assembly and so on. I mean, one vivid memory from, being 6 or 7 year old is sitting outside religious assembly, which they had every morning in the UK, on a bench. And there were 3 kids who couldn't go into assembly. One was me because I was exclusive brethren. One was a girl who was open brethren, which is another branch of the brethren movement. And she had to keep separate from me as well as keeping separate from the other students. And then there was another boy who was exclusive brethren, but his family had been withdrawn from. So he still wasn't allowed in, but he had to keep separate from the other 2 of us. So there was, 300 or 400 students, and then there were 3 different kinds of brethren sitting on the bench outside, keeping separate from each other and from the rest of the world.
Wow.
Which kind of just illustrates how ridiculous the whole thing is. So we got some we got company here.
Hi, cutie.
So yeah, I just went down I just completely absorbed, completely believed all the brethren doctrine. We were the special people. We were better than everyone else, and you felt sorry for everyone. And if you left, you'd go to hell, and if you stayed in, you'd go to heaven. And then things came to a head when I was in my in my 40s, I suppose. I had 5 children. I'd moved to Canada to strengthen a smaller Brethren congregation there. And I had a horrible road accident. I lost consciousness driving and had a terrible accident, and the person in the other vehicle was killed. And it was like a huge, I mean, it was a huge psychological shock because, of course, you blame yourself, you feel terribly guilty. But as you know, in these fundamentalist Christian groups, there's significance attached to everything that happens to you. And if something bad happens to you, it's God speaking to you. And so immediately the assumption was, the priest come to you, you've obviously done something terrible. What is it that God would speak to you in this way? And for some reason, and I still to this day have no idea why, they had come to the conclusion that this had happened to me because I'd cheated on my wife. It was completely fixed. There wasn't even any smoke, let alone any fire. But I don't know how or where they got this idea from. But having got this fixed in their head, they had me shut up, sort of staying in isolation, not allowed to speak to my wife or family. And of course, they weren't going to release me unless I confessed. And because I couldn't confess because I hadn't done it. I mean, I seriously considered just inventing something just so I could go back to be with my family. But trying to cope with this, along with the, all the guilt and the trauma of the crash and being isolated, I started to break down mentally. And I kind of, I was going every 2 weeks to see the priest. And I said to them, look, I'm feeling suicidal. I need psychological help. So they don't like to take stuff like this outside of the church. So they contacted a Brethren doctor in Australia, who was a cousin of the man of God, emailed him, and eventually they get an email back. They wouldn't let me see the email, but apparently this guy recommended that I should go to the Mayo Clinic down in Minnesota, which is kind of a place Brethren, for some reason, they go to there. They like to get very top-end medical treatment. So I was flown down there to see a psychologist, and I was psychiatrist, I suppose. I was puzzled because I said to the priest, like, I can't tell him that I've been shut up. I can't tell him I've been isolated because, it's all about the testimony and putting a good face on things. And they said, no, it's fine. You can tell him everything. And I thought, well, this is really odd because normally that's the kind of thing you mustn't talk about.
Yeah.
Anyway, I saw this guy, a hugely expensive private consultant, and he listened to my old story, and he didn't sort of comment on the fact that I'd, after this enormous trauma, I'd been isolated from my friends and family and left completely on my own. He recommended shock treatment, which is, basically like having a defibrillator put across your brain. And, I couldn't even afford the treatment. But I found out later that other brethren in similar circumstances had all been sent to see this one guy. And what we've found out since leaving is that the brethren have a network of kind of paid private psychologists around the globe that have got this, whether it's a written agreement or a verbal agreement, that they won't interfere with brethren priestly administration. So if, like, the priests are kind of driving someone into the earth by cruelty and isolation, the psychologists agree they won't say anything about that. They won't tell them that they need to leave the brethren. They won't tell them that they need to go back to their family. They'll just ply them with treatment and medication so that they can, continue to be tortured, putting it in my terms. So, I mean, the kind of effect of all that was it sowed some really serious doubts in my mind about the whole thing, because it's easy to believe in something when it's for your benefit and when you only see the nice side of it. But when you cross that line and become the victim of the system, and you see the ugly, unchristian, unkind, heartless side of it, it really makes you think. And then we were sent back to the UK, which was a huge blow to us. Like the man of God, I had an interview on the phone with the man of God. He sends me back to the UK in disgrace. You're a failure. You've messed up. And then things went very rapidly downhill from there. Commercialization of the Brethren was coming in very rapidly at that point, which was kind of completely against the way I'd been brought up. When I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, the Brethren were very unworldly and not at all materialistic, and people who had a bit of money or flaunted it a little bit were looked down on. All that was turning round, and it went right against, all of my instincts. And then really the thing that was the tipping point was the dishonesty that was, being promoted, really. It was, this spoiling Egyptians doctrine says that not only do you try and get as much money as you can from the world, but it's okay to, do misleading marketing or cheat a little bit or steal someone else's patent and just crush them in the court so you can get away with it. And, this destroyed the last shreds of my belief in the system. And once you no longer believe in the system, it's almost impossible to, the cognitive dissonance, as they say, to try and live and pretend. I just couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. So that was the end of the line. Having got out, and this sort of comes on to the next part of my story, I became a very outspoken critic of the Brethren and kind of exposed a lot of stuff. And that's what eventually led to all this sort of private investigators,
which we'll get into.
Yeah.
Wow.
So,
man, I have so I have
questions.
so many questions.
Yeah.
But one that I want to kind of cover, just for those people that are watching that have never even heard of the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church, is what is its foundation? Like, who started it? Do they have a prophet? Are they a leader? Do they believe they speak for God? Do they believe they are God? What's kind of the basis of this church? Because I know you mentioned in your story, Richard, that there are many splinter groups, right? Which means, was it a restorationalist? Like, how did it get started to begin with?
It's very like the Mormons, and it started at the same time. It's just on 200 years old. The same time as Joseph Smith was having his dreams, a guy called John Nelson Darby, who was a clergyman in Ireland, he was thrown off his horse and hit his head on the doorpost. I mean, you can blame the horse for everything if you like. I just wish he'd thrown him a little. If he'd have just thrown him a little bit harder, then history would be different. But so he was confined to bed, very, very sick for some weeks, and he had this amazing revelation, and he was going to, they were going to restore, like you say, restorationists. They were restoring the church to how it was in the days of the apostles, and all the sort of traditional church stuff with steeples and bishops and, all the trappings of Anglican or Catholic church. That was all, that was all wrong, and they were going back to this very simple. There was to be no hierarchy. Everyone's on the same level. It was quite a utopian ideal, and of course they had to keep strictly separate from evil, and they were going right back to the Bible, right back to the basics, and nothing else. And so he jumps up with this idea. And it was a time in the history of the world when all these new religious movements were springing up like mushrooms. I mean, along with the Mormons, there was the Jehovah's Witnesses, and there was the Seventh-day Adventists. And of course, they all thought that they were the real church and that everyone else was fake. And they all knew that they were the ones who were going by the Bible, and everyone else had misinterpreted the Bible. It's a very close parallel. I mean, they just pick and mix different verses of the Bible. Some will say, oh, well, that's just metaphorical and this is literal. And the others will say, oh, no, this is literal. We have to do this. And that's metaphorical. So they pick and choose, and they, build your own religion out of these readily available kit of parts called the Bible. So it started off much more conventional than the Mormons. I mean, the Mormons started out really, really weird and then became more mainstream. The Brethren started out quite mainstream and boring and became more and more weird. I don't know at what point they crossed over. But
did they consider, did that leader, did he call himself a prophet? Did he just, I know you said the word revelation.
You mentioned the man of God, I believe, too.
Yeah, called himself man of God.
he took very low ground, and the leaders generally took very, humble ground until I think it was 1969, sorry, 1959, when a guy called James Taylor Jr. took over, and he was like this extrovert and alcoholic, and he was very, very charismatic. He had a great sense of humor, and he loved the women and the alcohol, and kind of in keeping with the 60s generation, he took this very stuffy, boring, straight-laced, but quite conventional sect and turned it into a full-blown cult in the course of 10 years. And it's been, it's been wacky ever since. But then, they very quickly fell into the trap of having one leader, even if he was unofficial. Everyone hung on the words of this one guy, and he had his printed ministry that was distributed. And by the time you had sort of spanned the period from J.N. Darby right through to 59, it was really all about the man of God, and that's when they started calling him the man of God and the elect vessel and all the bullshit. And he became far more important to them than Jesus or God, although they wouldn't admit it. It became a personality cult of the leader, and whatever he did, they did. Whatever he said, they did.
Wow.
Sounds very similar to when Warren Jeffs took over for the FLDS, right?
Yeah, it's very much the same vibe. I mean, we all watched Keep Sweet, Pray and Obey, and it was like, hang on, I thought the Brethren had copyrighted this stuff.
That's what we think until we talk to almost every other group out there. We realize it's almost all the same stuff. It's just tweaked, like you said earlier, just tweaked a little bit to fit their agenda. So
different names for the same things.
Yeah. Speaking of their agenda, what are some of the main rules that either make the Brethren unique, or, I mean, they might make them the same as the FLDS or LDS, I'm not sure, but what are some of the main rules and principles behind their doctrine of, like, these are the things you can't do? Can you give us even, I know there's probably an extensive list, but a quick list.
All the time, and the list is very extensive. And it trips you up. I mean, yes, you can go to restaurants. No, you can't go to restaurants. Oh, yes, you can go to restaurants. No, I went to Australia and they're not going to restaurants now. But yes, it's very much separation from the world. You can't be, and the big ugly ones that cause the most pain and destruction are anyone who leaves. You can't have any more communication with. You cut them off. They're dead. You can't go to university, so like you've got this whole 55,000 people with no post-secondary education, and you have to work for Brethren business. So not only is your education cut off, your career is completely limited to working at whatever job your local Brethren business owner is going to condescend to give you. You can't go to a regular school; you have to go to Brethren school, and then. There's the sort of standard stuff. You can't wear jewelry. No, you can't have pets, you can't have cats and dogs. I mean, there's a sort of story that illustrates how horrific the thing is. In around 1970, just at the end of James Taylor Jr.'s life, he was the charismatic guy. He decided that pets were taking the affections of the Brethren away from Christ by, he probably meant himself, actually. So no more pets. And so all around the world, and I mean, there would have been 30, 40,000 Brethren at that point, they all took their pets to be put down. And in
pick them out the backyard.
In cities where there were a lot of Brethren, there would be a lineup of Brethren outside the vet with their cats and dogs, just having them put down, or they'd drown them, or whatever. It's a sort of a massive slaughter of animals, just because this man, on a whim, says so. Of course, he had a scripture for it. It was without are the dogs, which is, I think, somewhere near the end of Revelation. So, of course, that shows that you've got to, promote a slaughter of maybe 10,000 cats and dogs around the globe.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, today in 2024, they have everything. So your phones have to be owned by what they call UBT. It's their Universal Business Team. So their phones have Streamline 3 on them, your laptops, everything has to come through the church. They have an app. So if you want to travel, you have to put all your information into this app, which right now is controversial. We don't quite know what's happening with that app because a new thing came out where they have this travel ban and this travel form that you have to fill out. So like everything you do is controlled. It has to be approved. When a travel ban goes on, literally the 55,000 members don't travel except for the ones that rebel and don't say anything. The thing is that I want to say is you have to understand that even though this is a worldwide cult, if you were to visualize the head of the man of God, who is Bruce Hales right now, it's his head, his body is 55,000 people, and it's his feet and then his sons on the side, that the whole congregation moves together. And yes, there's a little bit of, New Zealand tends to be a little bit more rebellious, and, there's certain places that tend to be more strict and they, won't get away with what New Zealand gets away with. But the whole entity of it moves together. So even though we're spread all over the world, his web is very, very tightly knit. He spreads people all over from people he trusts, and he'll make them move to certain other congregations to keep the eyes and ears on them. It is such a tightly knit unit. Up until we had all of our work has been really paying off. And in Australia, which is the head of it all, their UBT precinct was raided by the ATO.
Oh, wow.
And so that's hit the news, and it has literally, my inbox, my social, it just is flooded because people are starting to question. We've been saying this all along on our podcast. People have been calling them out. And now that the ATO went in there, and it was the longest raid in Australian history.
Wow. Just to clarify that, ATO is the Australian Tax Office, which, and their officers are, and they have this kind of force of officers who actually conduct FBI type raids. So in some ways it was very much like the FBI going into Warren Jeff's compound. You've got these pictures. The precinct is the head office of the church, basically, of all the financial organisations of the church. It's this massive, extremely high-spec office building right in the heart of Sydney. And all these officers with the big white ATO initials on the back, just like the FBI goes in, the ATO goes in. What was it? There were about 20 or 30 officers in that building. And they go in without warning, and everyone has to step back from the desk, and they take the computers and they unlock the filing cabinets. You have to get the key for the safe. I think there were 100 officers, 120 officers involved across Australia, and they raided a whole series of Brethren businesses that were connected simultaneously. So it was a huge thing for them. It instantly severed all of their political influence, which they'd traded on extensively. Suddenly, these people are toxic because everyone hates a tax dodger. The government hates a tax dodger because the government's run on the tax, and the public hates them because they have to pay what these people don't. So
so it's interesting. So the Australian government was going after the church from the financial end.
Oh yeah.
Do you think there's ever a case for the government to go after them for criminal things as well? Or are there any criminal cases against in addition to that? Or are they mostly going after their money and their tax evasion?
Well, the finance is at the criminal level. It's money laundering on a massive scale. I was just talking to Cheryl about this earlier. If you talk about the FLDS and the Plymouth Brethren, they're both very Bible-based. There's a lot of similarities. But the FLDS has got this weird kind of polygamy, sexual angle to it that's like a really weird way out distortion of Christianity. The Brethren have very conventional marriage, but then they've got this really weird cultish obsession with money. And, like the FBI go into Warren Jeffs because of sexual abuse, and the ATO go into the Brethren because of financial abuse. It's all... it's just their particular vice, but they take it to such extremes that what starts off as being legal but a little bit kind of greedy and materialistic it just gets worse and worse until it's actually criminal. And that's the point at which the authorities come down like a ton of bricks
Right.
and do what they've been itching to do for a long time.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's always that one specific thing that the authorities finally have enough to go on to go after a group.
Exactly.
Because
Yeah, exactly.
because what the authorities finally get them for is one thing, but the unfortunate thing that we see time and time again is all of the same things, the abusive things, whether it's financial, sexual, all these things are happening in almost
Mhm.
all of the groups we talk to.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
And once it cracks open, all the worms come out of the can.
Right, exactly.
Exactly.
Like for the FLDS,
Yeah.
they were also abusing money. There was
Yeah.
money abuse, tax evasion. All these things were happening in the
Food stamp
FLDS,
fraud.
as well as the sexual stuff. And I imagine if you dig deeper, you will find sexual stuff in the group you're from too. So,
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's why I do my podcast. It's for those abuse survivors to come on. And I was speaking to a journalist the other day, and he was asking me, like, how high do you think it is? And I'm like, well, it's in every survivor that comes forward, whether they talk about it or not, it's in there. It's the sexual abuse
it's in every
rife
congregation. It's in every
Yeah.
one of their 300 congregations, for sure.
yeah.
Do you think, and I'm guessing in a smaller conservative Christian group, there wasn't a lot of sexual education?
None at all. Yeah.
Okay, so I wanted to ask if you think that that is a huge reason. We see it in a lot of the smaller groups, the more they're not willing to talk about or have any sexual education, it ends up grooming young children to not even know their own anatomy, let alone be able to spot what abuse is while they're being abused. It creates easier victims for people to exploit when there is no sex education, when there is no talk about things and everything's so quiet and hush hush. Was that the same in the Brethren as well?
Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. And it also creates conditions where if abuse happens, people won't talk about it. I mean, I was completely unaware that sexual abuse happened inside the Brethren till after I'd been married for a couple of years. And then my wife, my ex-wife now, told me that she had been sexually abused by an older Brethren man. And also that both her mother and her aunts had been abused. And I thought,
gosh.
wow, this is, terrible. I must have been horribly unlucky. I probably thought this was the only time this had ever happened in the whole of the Brethren. But it's not. It's just because it's not talked about. Unless you're actually married to someone, you've lived with them for a couple of years, they actually feel that they can confide in you that this has happened to them. But then having come out, you find that it's rampant. It's everywhere. And I mean, it's not just women that are being sexually abused. Boys are being sexually abused by men in there. There's plenty of cases of boys who've been sexually abused. It's horrific. But it's all covered up inside. And it's also covered up by the priest. So if someone goes, if you go to the priest, I mean, as my wife, all had to go to the priest and be looked at. But there's no question of going to the police or anything. It's all dealt with internally and covered up and hidden away because it would be a bad testimony. It would give the Brethren a bad name if the police heard about it. Well, I mean, the way to keep a good reputation is not to allow it to happen in the first place, not to cover it up, which enables it to be perpetuated.
I received an email from an insider just this past week that was heart-wrenching. And they were telling me of their sexual abuse that happened to them and another member of the family. And they went through, what the priest had come, how I had been asked to, that he'd made it right. He'd come clean with what they had been doing and asking them, like, it's time, you got to let it go. It's done with, it's been dealt with. It's been, you just let it go. There's no going to the police. But yet when you read these articles, like if you Google Exclusive Brethren, Plymouth Brethren Christian, there's tons of articles. And every single time the spokesperson for the church, as I'm sure you guys experience in the same way, they always have this facade, all these one-liners that they come up with that, like, no, yes, people can have something to do with their children that have left. Yes, you can come and join if you want. They go through, yes, we contact the police. And, it's absolute lies what they deliver to the public
lies,
versus what actually happens. And this is right up into just this past week, someone who'd come forward again. And it's still happening in there where it's just like, we got to shove this underneath the rug.
Man, and the more money people have or an organization
Yep.
has, the easier it is for them to shove things under the rug.
They're big lawyers. They always use the very best lawyers, the most expensive lawyers, and they've got unlimited budget. And yeah, there's a lot you can do if you're prepared to splash a few million around.
Or hire
Right.
PIs like they did on Richard and like hunted him and his wife down like crazy. Like it was.
Is this your current wife, Richard, that they've been hunting?
Yeah,
Or
so,
your
so after
ex-wife?
about 5 years after I left, I remarried. I went to Jamaica and married a Jamaican girl, and which of course was a bit of a rebellion on my part because interracial marriage is strictly banned inside the Brethren.
Good for you.
So yeah, well, it was quite a fresh start in life, and that's yeah, you saw my daughter, so
She's beautiful.
but yeah, I mean, we're just we had absolutely no money. I lived in Jamaica with her for 6 months, which was a fantastic experience, but complete third world poverty. And then we were planning on settling in Canada. So she moved to Canada first. I had to go to the UK to earn some money and sort out some legal problems. And then a year later, I joined her in Toronto. And we were living in a quite a, not a rough area, but not a nice area, in a sort of windowless single room in a basement. That's all we could afford. She was going to school. She was going to university. I was working like night shift in a bakery, and we were kind of scraping through and saving and building a new life literally from the bottom up. And the first thing that happened, the first thing we knew about the kind of private investigator situation was I had a very good friend called Dr. Singh, who I knew from business, from back when I was in the Brethren. He wasn't in the Brethren, but he was one of my customers, and I got on very well with him. Very academic professor of physics with 25 published papers. Very, very quietly spoken. English. He's born in London, and he also moved to Canada. And after I'd left, we sort of briefly had a bit of a joint business venture together. I was trying to make trying to do some of my old work, which was in optics. And so we had a website that had both our names on it. And so for anyone trying to find me, if they go on the internet, the only place they're going to find my name would have been on this website with Dr. Singh. So naturally, private investigators trying to find me, the first person they spoke to was Singh. So he calls me up one day. He says he's had this private investigator pestering him for information about where Richard Marsh is. He said the guy's very persistent. He's offering me, he phoned me several times, and he's turned up on my doorstep in Edmonton. And kind of pushed his way into the house and offered me $5,000 if he would set up a meeting with me. And Kirat he's a very, very intelligent guy, and he just played it cool. He didn't express strong emotion, but he was very disgusted with this guy. And so he phoned me up, and he said, look, I think what we could do is we could do a sting operation. He said, I could pretend to be, he's a very, very clever computer guy. I could pretend to be a hacker, and I could offer to this guy to hack into Marsh's emails, and then we can use that to feed him misinformation and make out that you're actually in the UK while you're really in Canada. So, it was super kind of him to put everything on the line like that. And that's exactly what he did. The way he did it was he called up the PR and he said, look, Marsh is my friend. I'm not going to betray him, but I do have a friend from university days over in the UK who was really good at hacking, and it's possible this guy could help you. And the PI kind of bit his hand off. So then Kirat sets up some funky private email address that was just sort of symbols and ciphers, emails the guy and says, hi, Mr. Morse. I'm Kirat's friend from England. He said you might have some work for me, and I can hack and I can do this and I can do that. And the PI his name's Stuart Morse, and he runs this business called Pro West Investigations out of Calgary, Alberta. And he must be like a few sandwiches short of a picnic. He actually goes back to this hacker with his full, like, proper email address and proper heading, Pro-West Investigations. Oh, yes, please hack Mr. Marsh. How much would you charge? And, can you get his bank details? And can you find out this and that about him? And anyway, so what follows from that is a whole series of 33 emails backwards and forwards between the hacker and Morse. And of course, the hacker's really Kirat. And all I'm doing is I'm composing emails on my regular email, screen printing them, sending them to Kirat, who was selling them to Morse. And the emails showed that I was in England, and I was doing this and that in England, and of course, to make it realistic, we had to take the money. I mean, not that I was averse to taking the money, but I mean, at the end of the deal, Kirat and I split the income. And I think, if I remember rightly, Morse had by that point paid out about $6,000 for my email.
Wow.
And I mean, he wanted my emails and he got them, so there's nothing illegal. And I mean, he thought he was doing something illegal, but he actually wasn't, because it was actually with my consent that he was reading them. But anyway, eventually, obviously, Morse realized, or his client, who was the Brethren, realized that we were pulling their leg. And it all cut off, and, nothing could induce Morse to part with any more money. So we kind of thought, well, what are they going to do now? Because they're obviously after me. They've given up on Morse. Anyway, there's this kind of calm before the storm silence. And then my wife comes home from work one day. I mean, she was at school, but she was also working in a Jamaican restaurant. And she said, she comes bursting through the door. She said, someone's followed me home. And here we go.